Welcome back to the things that bother me. On this channel, we talk about the things people are thinking, but often don't say out loud. The systems, the policies, the decisions, and the consequences that shape everyday life. Because sometimes the biggest problems in society are the ones everyone quietly steps around. And today we're starting a new series. A series about a generation that rarely gets talked about. Generation X. The generation born roughly between the mid-1960s and early 1980s. A generation that grew up during enormous change in America. A generation that was told something very specific about its future. We were told we could be anything. That message was everywhere. In classrooms, in television, in culture, in the advice adults gave their children. Work hard, go to school, follow the rules, and the future would open up. But as Generation X moved through life, stage by stage, something strange started to happen. The system underneath those promises kept changing. Industries disappeared. Costs exploded. Opportunities shifted. And the rules that were supposed to guarantee success didn't seem to work the same way anymore. This series is going to look at that journey. From childhood, to adulthood, to the present moment. 8 episodes examining the life path of a generation that often found itself caught between forces it didn't create. A generation raised to believe in unlimited opportunity, while the structure supporting that opportunity was quietly transforming. This isn't nostalgia, and it isn't an attack on any single group. It's a look at history as it actually unfolded. Because if we want to understand where the country is going, we have to understand what happened along the way. So in this series, we're going to walk through the full story. What Generation X was told, what actually happened, and what the future may still hold. This is Generation X. We were told we could be anything. Let's begin. Generation X. We were told we could be anything. Episode 1. You can be anything. The promise that filled every classroom. If you were a kid in America in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, there was a message that followed you everywhere. It was on the walls of your classroom. It was printed on posters with astronauts, doctors, scientists, and smiling professionals in white coats. Teachers said it. Guidance counselors said it. Parents repeated it. You can be anything. Not maybe. Not sometimes. Anything. The future was supposed to be wide open. Limitless. Full of opportunity waiting for anyone willing to work hard enough. Study hard. Stay in school. Get an education. Do those things, and the world would open its doors. The message was simple and powerful. America was the land of opportunity. The American dream wasn't just possible. It was practically guaranteed. Generation X grew up breathing that idea. It wasn't presented as a hope or an aspiration. It was presented like a fact. The system worked. Hard work led to success. Effort led to reward. Play by the rules and you would be fine. Millions of kids believed it completely. Why wouldn't they? Every adult around them was repeating the same story. But outside those classrooms, something else was already happening. Something quiet. Something structural. Something that would eventually change the future of an entire generation. Because while kids were hearing about unlimited opportunity, the economic foundations that made those promises possible were already beginning to crack. Most of us just didn't know it yet. 1. The posters on the wall. Step into a typical classroom during the 1980s and you would see it instantly. Bright posters lining the walls. An astronaut floating in space. A surgeon standing confidently in an operating room. A scientist holding a test tube. Underneath the images were the words every kid heard again and again. You can be anything. Teachers believed it. Many of them grew up during a time when the economy really did seem to reward hard work. Guidance counselors repeated it like a mantra. Parents said it with pride. They weren't trying to mislead anyone. Most of them believed the message themselves. The United States had spent decades building the most powerful middle class in modern history. For the generations before Gen X, the path looked straightforward. Graduate high school. Get a job. Work hard. Build a stable life. That system had worked well enough for many families that the idea of endless opportunity started to feel permanent. So when adults looked at their children and said, "You can be anything," it didn't sound unrealistic. It sounded like common sense. 2. The economy was already shifting, but while the message stayed the same, the system underneath it was beginning to change. Factories were closing. Manufacturing jobs were moving overseas. Automation was slowly replacing workers in industries that once supported entire communities. Towns that had been built around steel mills, auto plants, and factories began losing their economic backbone. These changes didn't happen overnight. They unfolded gradually, quietly, and often far from the classrooms where kids were hearing about unlimited possibilities. But the shift was real. The economic model that had supported the American middle class for decades was starting to transform. And when systems change, promises built on those systems eventually collide with reality. 3. The culture of success. The 1980s didn't just promote opportunity. They celebrated success. Television showed powerful executives in skyscrapers. Movies glorified wealth, ambition, and winning. Advertising told people that success looked like big houses, new cars, and financial freedom. The cultural message was relentless. Success was normal. Success was expected. Success was what happened when you tried hard enough. The line between ambition and inevitability started to blur. Kids weren't just told they could succeed. They were told success was waiting for them. All they had to do was reach out and grab it. 4. The fame dream. But the promise didn't stop at ordinary success. By the 1980s and early 1990s, a new idea had taken hold. You didn't just have to become successful. You could become famous. Music television exploded. Hollywood stories celebrated overnight stardom. Athletes became global icons. The message was clear and intoxicating. If you never gave up, you could make it. Rock star, actor, professional athlete, celebrity. Kids were told that persistence alone could push them all the way to the top. Keep trying. Never quit. Your big break might be right around the corner. For young people, it felt like the world had no limits. But fame operates under a brutally simple truth. For every one person who reaches the spotlight, millions never will. The dream wasn't impossible, but it was never designed for everyone. And when a culture tells an entire generation that extraordinary success is simply a matter of determination, it plants a powerful idea deep in people's minds. If you don't make it, you must not have tried hard enough. 5. The myth of infinite opportunity. The idea that everyone can become anything sounds inspiring, but it ignores basic reality. Society does not have unlimited positions. Not everyone becomes a doctor. Not everyone becomes wealthy. Not everyone becomes famous. Opportunity exists, but it has boundaries shaped by economics, policy, timing, and circumstance. When millions of children are told the future has no limits, they grow up expecting a world that doesn't actually exist. The promise becomes bigger than the system that supports it. And eventually that mismatch creates tension. 6. Education becomes the answer. As traditional career paths began fading, a new message replaced them. College. If the economy was changing, education was presented as the solution. Go to college. Get a degree. Everything will work out. Teachers encouraged it. Parents pushed it. Guidance counselors made it sound like the only safe path forward. For Generation X, college became more than an opportunity. It became an expectation. But something else was happening at the same time. The cost of higher education was beginning to climb rapidly, and the solution being offered to millions of students was simple: loans. 7. The psychological contract. When children grow up hearing the same promise repeated thousands of times, it shapes the way they see the world. They believe effort equals reward. They believe the system is fair. They believe that if they do everything right, life will unfold the way they were told it would. This creates what psychologists sometimes call an unspoken contract. If I work hard, the system will take care of the rest. That belief becomes deeply personal, which means when the system doesn't deliver what was promised, the first instinct isn't to question the system. It's to question yourself. 8. The silent structural change. By the time Generation X began approaching adulthood, several long-term shifts were already underway. Corporate loyalty was fading. Job security was weakening. Benefits were shrinking. The concept of working for one company for 30 years and retiring with stability was becoming rare. But these changes didn't immediately show up in the messaging young people received. The promise stayed exactly the same. Work hard. Follow the rules. Everything will work out. Reality was about to test that belief. 9. The collision ahead. For many members of Generation X, the moment of realization didn't happen in childhood. It happened later. After graduation. After sending out resumes. After entering a workforce that looked very different from the one their parents had described. The opportunities were still there, but they were fewer, harder to reach, and increasingly unstable. The ladder people expected to climb wasn't gone entirely, but many of its rungs had already been removed. And millions of young adults were about to discover that the promise they had grown up believing was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. 10. The beginning of the story. Every generation starts with a story about its future. For Generation X, the story was simple. You can be anything. You can do anything. Your future has no limits. It sounded incredible. It sounded fair. It sounded like the world was waiting. But history doesn't run on slogans. History runs on economic shifts, technological change, political decisions, and timing. And by the time Generation X was ready to step into adulthood, the world they had been prepared for was already disappearing. In closing, the children sitting in those classrooms believed what they were told. They had no reason not to. Adults said it with confidence. Teachers repeated it like a universal truth. Parents passed it down because it was the same promise they had been given when they were young. You can be anything. To a kid, that sentence sounds like freedom. It sounds like possibility. It sounds like the future is waiting for you personally. So Generation X grew up believing the rules were clear. Work hard. Stay out of trouble. Get an education. Keep pushing forward. If you followed those steps, the reward would come. The system would work. That belief shaped an entire generation's expectations about how life was supposed to unfold. But the thing about promises is this: they only matter if the structure behind them is still standing. And by the time Generation X was sitting in those classrooms, something fundamental was already shifting beneath the surface of the country. The economy was changing. Industries were disappearing. Stable careers were slowly becoming unstable. Costs were rising in ways people didn't fully understand yet. None of that showed up on the posters hanging on the walls. Those posters still showed astronauts, doctors, scientists, successful people smiling confidently under the words, "You can be anything." No poster ever said, "You can be anything if the economy stays stable." No teacher ever explained, "You can be anything," unless the system changes. And systems do change. They always have. They always will. The children hearing those promises didn't know that the ground underneath their future was already beginning to move. They were just kids. They believed what the adults told them. They believed what the culture reinforced. They believed the story. And for a while, that story felt real. But eventually, every generation reaches a moment when belief meets reality. For Generation X, that moment was coming. It wouldn't happen all at once. It would happen slowly, graduation by graduation, layoff by layoff, bill by bill, expectation colliding with experience. Because the story Generation X grew up with was about unlimited possibility. But the story they were about to live would look very different. The promise was simple. You can be anything. The reality would prove much more complicated. And that collision between promise and reality is where the true story of Generation X begins. Next episode, the Latchkey Generation. So that was the beginning of the story. Generation X growing up surrounded by a powerful message repeated everywhere they turned. You can be anything. It sounded hopeful. It sounded fair. It sounded like the future was wide open. And millions of kids believed it. They believed that if they worked hard enough, studied hard enough, and played by the rules, the opportunities promised to them would be there waiting. But while that promise filled classrooms, television screens, and family conversations, something else was happening quietly in the background. The economy was shifting. Industries were beginning to disappear. The stable ladder earlier generations had climbed was starting to change. Most kids growing up in the 70s and 80s had no idea those shifts were already underway. They were just hearing the promise. And for a while, the promise felt real. But every promise eventually meets reality. And for Generation X, that moment was coming. The story we just started is only the first piece of a much larger picture. Because childhood optimism eventually leads to adulthood experience. And when Generation X began stepping into the real world, they encountered something very different from the world they had been prepared for. That's where the next part of the story begins. In the next episode, we look at something that shaped Generation X in ways that still echo today. A generation that often grew up learning independence earlier than anyone expected. Coming home to empty houses. Making their own meals. Solving their own problems. Learning early that sometimes the world expects you to figure things out on your own. Episode 2. The Latchkey Generation. But before we get there, if you found this episode interesting, thought-provoking, or even a little uncomfortable, that's exactly the point of this channel. Here on The Things That Bother Me, we talk about the things people notice but don't always stop to examine. The patterns in society. The systems behind everyday life. And the questions that deserve a closer look. If that's the kind of conversation you want to be part of, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of the series. Because the story of Generation X is far from over. And what happens next might explain a lot about the world we're living in today. This is The Things That Bother Me. Until next time.